Hello and welcome to another episode of the Smaulgld Subscriber Sound Off, where Smaulgld subscribers get to know me and whoever else is listening what's on their mind. And today I'm delighted to have Josh Wylie on the phone. Hello, Josh. How are you today?
I'm doing all right, Lewis. How about yourself? Thanks so much for having me on.
Oh, thanks for coming on the show, Josh. Delighted to have you. Now, Josh, how long have you been a Smaulgld subscriber?
Oh goodness, a Smaulgld subscriber proper, probably about a year and a half now. Since the reboot, really. I was familiar with your work before that. I'd run across it on a couple of different aggregator sites, but it was only after a mutual friend and also a Smaulgld subscriber, Joshua Roberts, who runs a small YouTube channel, really said, "Hey, if you're dissatisfied with the way alternative financial media is going, you need to check out this channel, Smaulgld." And I've been a diehard fan ever since.
Oh, thank you very much. Referrals are our best business, right? Now, Josh, I understand you operate, and I've checked them out, two websites. I want to talk about both of them, and they'll serve as kind of the jumping off point of what we're going to talk about today. They are Stateless Homesteading and Crypto Hero. Can you first describe what the purpose of Stateless Homesteading is, how you started that, and then also I'd like to talk about one of your feature articles, Dr. BRICS Love, or How Alt Media Learned to Stop Worrying and Love the New World Order, which is a very interesting take on, and a take which is counter to much of the alternative financial media's view on what exactly the BRICS are doing, what the AIB is doing, and China in general. So the floor is yours, Josh.
Well, thanks for that. Stateless homesteading, as per its name, was actually initially supposed to be me cataloging my process of going off grid. I left the University of Michigan in 2012, and I bought 4 acres of land in northern Michigan. I built my own house from the ground up, put solar panels on it, and started growing my own food. And stateless homesteading originally was supposed to catalog that process. But somewhere along the line, I started writing about geopolitics and macrofinance instead, because that was really where my primary interest was. And at the time, in 2013, 14, 15 timeframe, the hot topic throughout alternative media was the rise of the BRICS, the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank, and the gold-backed yuan. And I would read articles about this on websites like Silver Doctors and Zero Hedge and SGT Report on a regular basis. And for a while, I bought this stuff hook, line, and sinker. As a precious metals investor, I was certainly financially vested in the story, and I wanted it to be true. But eventually, that reality, that narrative, ran headlong with my geopolitical reality that I had discovered through essentially reading a lot of history books. And I started to notice that maybe there was something a little smelly about this narrative. And I really started blogging about that actively on Stateless Homesteading in 2015. My first article was about Agenda 21 in China, and how this is essentially a bunch of Anglo-American corporations that were financing this technocratic neo-feudalism in these ghost cities in China. And that article was pretty well received. So I thought, well, if people are interested in hearing about, these geopolitical machinations, then maybe they'll be interested in hearing an alternative take on finance as well. So I really set my intellectual curiosity towards investigating this idea of a gold-backed yuan. And what I found very quickly was not only that Chinese commercial banks had been involved with the London Bullion Market Association for many decades prior to when most people in alternative media had said that they were joining with these institutions. You also find that the People's Bank of China and its head, Zhou Xiaochuan, is very invested in the Bank for International Settlements, holding a board position there. You look at individuals like Jinli Kun, who's a former vice chair of the Asian Development Bank, supposedly a vassal bank of the World Bank. He is now the head of the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank. And these things really made me start scratching my head. To confirm all this, I came across a policy paper written by Zhou Xiaochuan called Reform the International Monetary System. And within this policy paper, he makes note of a gold and silver standard as being something of the past and having certain merits, but he's far more interested in this paper in increasing yuan liquidity through the SDR and entry into the SDR basket. And this was a time, Lewis, before China and the yuan had been officially accepted into the basket. The only figure in alternative media talking about the yuan being a part of the SDR was really Jim Rickards, and Jim Rickards is hated in alternative media because of his connections as an insider. And I understand where people are coming from, but I kind of took him at face value and ran with it for a little while. And I found that story was demonstrably true, the Rickards perspective, that China was far more interested not in a gold-backed yuan, but in SDR inclusion and increased yuan liquidity globally. So when I heard other alternative media figures saying that a 100% gold-backed yuan is on the horizon and it's coming very soon, I just pointed to the head of the PBOC saying they don't want this, guys. And there were a number of figures that came out publicly against some of the articles I was writing early on who said this is a joke, the idea that China wants anything to do with the IMF or the SDR. And then lo and behold, a year later, they're in the basket. So that was really my introduction to going against the grain of traditional alternative thinking.
Interesting. Now, one of the things I do know about Jim Rickards, though, is he said two other things. He also said that he's also said they're interested in backing the yuan, not just joining the SDR. And he's also said that the SDR will be the world reserve currency in January 2018. And he's also said that the SDR will include a gold component. So I think he's covered all of his bases on what might actually happen. So yes, he may have said that China wanted admission to the SDR, but he's also played the side of gold-backed yuan and gold-backed SDR.
That's true, and Rickards is the type of guy who has to talk his own book. I'm sure that in his policy meetings where he's talking to intelligence agencies and supranational banking entities, these are far more war gamed scenarios than they are presented as facts. But Rickards very slyly presents them as insider information. And quite frankly, Lewis, I don't know how much insider information the man really has, because I caught him last week regurgitating that oil for gold bond story that you have so thoroughly debunked on Smaulgld, as has Kuz Jansen, who is a darling of alternative finance media until he disagrees with them, which I think is true of many people.
Well, one of the things about alternative financial media, it is definitely, and I want to get your thoughts on this, it is more of a cheerleading forum than it is a place to discuss, dissect, and actually challenge the narratives. And, if a narrative is properly challenged, Josh, I think then it gets strengthened. But if it's not properly challenged, it can go off into a direction where people are actually believing a falsehood and are setting themselves up for mega disappointment. And then when that narrative fails, doesn't happen, it seems they just trot out another one.
Oh, the narratives are disappeared, Lewis. You don't see people talking about the rise of the BRICS or a 100% gold-backed yuan nearly as much as you did 3 or 4 years ago. And to a certain extent, I think enthusiasm for the Trump campaign really swept a lot of that under the rug.
Let me ask you a question, because do you think that the gold and silver sales, Josh, are down because of that, something to do with Trump? I know that's been presented as well, and it seems, I never thought of it that way, that a lot of these narratives have gone away because of the attention on enthusiasm on Trump. Do you think people are stopped buying physical gold and silver from the U.S. Mint because of Trump?
From a Western perspective,
yes.
Yeah, I think that has a big deal to do with it. That and the rise of cryptocurrencies, especially this year, seeing these speculative gains that I think people wrongly invest in gold and silver for those speculative gains, but they thought that silver was going to be $600 an ounce, and it wasn't. So now they're chasing the asset that's going up. They're chasing the flows. I would tend to concur with that thesis.
Okay, we're going to get into cryptos a little later on in the program. I want you to continue talking about the stateless homesteading and the narratives that you got involved with after you stop talking about homesteading. So continue now with the AIB and BRICS narrative and the gold back yuan stories.
Yeah, so I had challenged this narrative really on a full spectrum dominance scale. I was challenging it economically by saying, as you have, certain aspects of this don't make sense in terms of why would China want to spend its gold hoard into the open market. I was looking at, from a geopolitical perspective, the notion that the AIIB and the BRICS Bank were somehow resistant to the Anglo-American establishment, and seeing not only the players like Jin Li-kun and Zhou Xiaochuan, who are just as much Western players as they are Eastern players, based on their position within entities like the Bank for International Settlements and the World Bank. I saw this as a build out of infrastructure and financial instruments in tandem, almost an equalizing of the world monetary system, more so than it was an East versus West dialectic. I think there are elements of that at play based on regional supremacy, and China rightfully probably wanting influence in its own backyard more so than the American Navy. But these conflicts, like Senkaku or what's going on now in Bhutan, I think these are more ancillary to the big picture, where these groups are really kind of working in concert, which is why their monetary policy also works in concert. They all print money at the same time, or when one stops when one is easing, the other is printing to maintain a sense of stability there. And I was very frustrated, quite frankly, Lewis, with the fact that so many gold cheerleaders didn't want to investigate it from that perspective because it was against their bottom line. That was really the crux of what stateless homesteading was all about, and this kind of poured out of me in what I would call my magnum opus at this point in my 25 years of existence on this planet. This article called Dr. BRICS Love, or Why the Alternative Media Learned to Stop Worrying and Love the New World Order. There's an entity called Chatham House, and Chatham House is essentially the British version of the Council on Foreign Relations. It's a tremendously influential think tank and policymaker for Anglo-American finance. And one of the things that Chatham House did after the 2008 financial crisis was they established something called the Chatham House Gold Task Force. And the Chatham House Gold Task Force essentially agrees with the gold bugs to a large extent by saying that gold needs to be reintroduced into the international monetary system on a very small scale. They say something like 5 to 10% to give the international monetary system confidence, much like you described when the Fed talks its book up or down, depending on how it wants the market to act, or using PR evangelism to promote rate hikes or easing or tightening at any given time. Chatham House views gold not as really a pragmatic monetary instrument. They view it as a confidence booster. And they also say that they don't want gold to be redeemable at any level, not even necessarily for nation states, but they just want it there as a token asset to give people confidence in a world that's awash in debt. And I thought it was astounding that Chatham House, which is an institution that's demonstrably globalist, was so in line with what alternative media was saying at the time. And they took this theory, Lewis, even further in a policy paper earlier last year, where they talk not only about the reintroduction of gold to the monetary system, but that America needs to play the role of a steward of globalism by allowing China far more influence over institutions like the IMF, and that they viewed the rise of the BRICS and the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank as a dream come true for the build out of multilateral institutions in the East. And this is a narrative that is parroted in alt media quite often. I just thought the contrast between an alternative media blogger saying that and a globalist institution being on the same page was dumbfounding to me. So I thought people should know about that. When I published that article, I thought it was going to be a very popular piece. Not because I wanted any kind of recognition, but because I really wanted people to to think about this. And one of the alternative media aggregators that I sent my work to and had republished all of it previous to this. And it's a bigger website. So this website is one that other alt media aggregators pick from quite a bit. So if you get submitted at this particular website, the odds are your story is going to be syndicated fairly widely. I had one story that InfoWars picked up this way. Still don't know how I feel about that necessarily, but
just so everybody knows, this is a forbidden article, and I will post the link below on the Smaulgld channel, and it was published on May 26, 2016.
Yes, and that's really the only way you can put it, is it was a form of soft censorship. These people that I built a relationship with contacted me and said, not that the article was inaccurate, not that they didn't like the information, but that it promoted what they called infighting, and it ruffled too many feathers. I'm not sure if those feathers are purely monetary, that, this isn't good for gold and silver affiliate sales, or if there's something a little bit more nefarious at foot. But I was always under the impression that, the alternative media were like the pamphleteers of the 1700s, Lewis, and that, these people could disagree. They could even come to blows sometimes, but ultimately it was about striving for a common discourse to evolve the narrative of liberty. And I very quickly found that that's not the case with modern alternative media. It is, if you challenge the narrative, you are silenced. And these same outfits, I find it ironic that they're now complaining about, Google and YouTube censoring them and cutting off their ad revenue when they do it themselves.
Well, media is media and people are people. One of the things I think Murray Rothbard said, he made the mistake of going into business with other libertarians, and he said, just because they're libertarians doesn't mean they're not jackasses or assholes. It doesn't matter. So when someone says they're in favor of something and you agree with them, doesn't necessarily mean they agree with you on other things. But what is it about this article you think? Where does it ruffle the feathers? The Dr. BRICS Love article.
In that article, and by the way, Lewis, I took great care in that article not to mention anyone by name, and I won't here.
There are no names in it. It's well documented. You have links to the original sources, which is another thing that I'm big on, as you know. You can have an opinion, but it has to be stated as such. But if you say something like in that Goldback Yuan article, China is expected to, you got to tell me where you got that expectation from. Otherwise, it sounds to me like you just made it up. This article doesn't do that. You've cited Agenda 21. You've got all the Chatham House sources. You even republished some of them. But what is it about this article that would ruffle feathers? Because to me, it just sounds like you're presenting more information.
Well, Lewis, you're right in that, and all of my work at Stateless Homesteading, the core of it was about primary sources, because that, I think, is the best way to discern truth. As you have done a great job demonstrating, with things like PBOC gold purchases or treasury purchases, looking at the raw documentation is really the best thing we have to go off of. So all of my articles on that website are built around documents, policy papers, pieces of legislation that actually exist. They aren't rampant speculation. Some of my conclusions are speculative, but I am fairly good, I think, about noting that as speculation. And furthermore, I don't just cite these policy papers or link to them. I take the time to actually screenshot the passages from these PDFs, essentially, and put them in the body of the article, because I also know that in this BuzzFeed-esque kind of world of social media, most people aren't going to sit down and read even a 20-page policy paper, but they might read someone who's screen capped the most important parts of that policy paper.
And also underline them in red.
Yes. Yeah, I mean, I try and spell it out for people very succinctly.
Right.
But what I really think ruffled feathers with the BRICS Love piece is not just that demonstrating that these globalist institutions essentially viewed the same things that alternative media did, but that some of the things that alternative media personalities were saying were not just inaccurate, but totally and utterly false. There's one portion in that BRICS Love article where a prominent alternative media figure speaking with Bill Holter says essentially that the BRICS and the AIIB are a perfect example of how the Zbigniew-Brzezinski grand chessboard model is failing, and that the East is offering a counter to this Anglo-American force, essentially. And I had to scratch my head at that one, Lewis, because as someone who studied Brzezinski for a few years now and has read the grand chessboard a couple of times, I remember vividly that he has an entire chapter on the build-out of multilateral institutions in the East. And I screen capped that portion of Brzezinski's book and also underlined it because he says quite succinctly that these multilateral institutions in the East, like the ADB, aren't going to cut it, and the World Bank are not going to cut it, that we need more infrastructure, both industrial and financial, to really build out this Eastern miracle. You have institutions like the United Nations Council on Trade and Development saying the exact same thing. They published a policy paper in 2014 called BRICS, A Dream Coming True, ? Talking about the BRICS Bank being used to finance Agenda 21 and these other technocratic, globalist kind of infrastructure build-outs. And of course, that when they say the BRICS, a dream coming true ? That's a direct allusion to the Goldman Sachs paper where the term BRICS is coined, because that paper is called Dreaming with BRICS, the Path to 2030. So Goldman Sachs, phrases the statement, and then the United Nations comes out and answers the question 10 years later.
Right. So the alternative media has the common narrative is that the BRICS and the AIB are working directly against the United States, and what you're saying is that the BRICS and the AIB are part and parcel of the entire globalist agenda.
Yes, and to think that they are pure antagonists is utter nonsense. Professor Carol Quigley, a Georgetown professor, wrote a book called Tragedy and Hope, which I have taken a lot of my historical knowledge from. He was a man who was involved in the Cecil Rhodes Roundtable in its early days, setting up the Chatham House and the Council on Foreign Relations, which is why I analyze those institutions in particular and think they're incredibly politically pertinent. But upon looking at these institutions and their involvement in the East, you come to realize very quickly that these aren't antagonists to the West, at least not in the way that they're presented.
And I think the antagonism that people want to portray upon them is or draws from a desire that somehow if they antagonize and they challenge the dollar, that's good for gold. And if it's good for gold and you hold it, well then more power to the BRICS and the AIB.
Yes. Yeah. Absolutely. At its core, too, I think, putting aside the geopolitical for a moment, there's a psychological element at play here. Now, I don't mean to offend anyone with spiritual beliefs or anything, but I find that a lot of people
your
in the
show.
West,
Go ahead.
I find that a lot of people in the West, and again, I don't mean to offend any Christians out there, but a lot of alternative media figures who maintain a Christian worldview have a savior complex. Many think that we're living in the end times and that no matter what happens, Jesus will come back and save us. But some have even supplanted that onto geopolitics. Putin, for example, is viewed as a godlike figure in alternative media. China and the BRICS are viewed at what I call the BRICS savior paradigm. They're viewed as someone who's going to come down from on high and rescue us from ourselves. Even the narrative, Lewis, of dollar collapse places the impetus of change on essentially the international monetary system fucking up, for lack of a better term, and delivering that financial salvation unto us, as opposed to us individually actually having to act and make change on an individual and a societal level. They're always waiting from someone on high to deliver salvation to them, and that is at the core of the BRIC savior meme, and it's at the expense of all other analysis of that meme. Zhou Jiaochuan, he must be a good guy because he's the head of People's Bank of China and he's buying all this gold. Never mind that he is the number 2 guy at the Bank for International Settlements, the supposed central bank of central banks that's directing all of this international monetary policy in the first place. To me, that it was just so ridiculous that it's almost a religious belief, very much the same way that the left has become godless, but not really, because they've replaced the state as now their god.
Right.
And gold bugs, it's almost as if the PBOC has become their god.
Well, it seems like people project what they want onto people and organizations, and generally, if there's any kernel of truth that that organization might support their efforts, well, then they're going to be very receptive to hearing stories about how they're doing X, Y, or Z and how that's going to help you. And I find that if you just do analysis, I'm not interested in criticizing and trashing the AIB or BRICS, but if you point out things where it doesn't fit neatly with what somebody has projected onto them, well, then you're a shill, or you don't understand, and then you get these questions, well, how can you prove that what I'm saying isn't true? And it's almost as if it's the idea that they don't want to debate it. They don't want to hear it. And they just want to say, this is true. Get with the program. And that goes counter to what I think alternative media is supposed to be, because I've pointed out in the past that alternative media does a great job of challenging mainstream media memes. They do a horrific job of challenging their own. Now,
Yes.
having said that, let's move on now to cryptocurrency, because this is another area where people have divided into camps. There are people that are convinced that cryptocurrencies are a New World Order, a CIA invention, mark of the beast, and anything relating to digital is bad news. And once you take that point of view, you really can't argue. And then there's others who believe that the whole digitization holds tremendous promise because it can help people empower themselves by, even if they can just buy small pieces of digital assets, it allows them to maintain perhaps a certain level of privacy, not just with Bitcoin, but with other coins. What is your take on cryptocurrencies first in general, and then get as specific as you want from there?
Sure. And you bring up a really good point about alt media in general, and that it's become very binary and there is no nuance to it. And that's the nuance is where the interesting information is to me. Cryptocurrencies, especially as I'm 25 years old, so as a millennial, I guess they interest me far more than, strictly hard asset guys. I first came across Bitcoin, Lewis, in 2010. I was on a gaming forum, and a buddy of mine said they had no monetary value at the time. And he said, oh, check out this thing. People are using it to trade magic cards. You can mine this weird currency with your computer. And I didn't think much of it at the time. And it wasn't until I had, graduated from high school and was out living on my own where it came to my attention again through the Silk Road. And at this point, I had learned far more about Austrian economics, and what Samuel Edward Konkin III would refer to as the agora, or the black market, and that market-based economics is really one of the few ways an individual could bring about change. So I looked at Bitcoin being used to subvert what I view as state monopolies in many instances on the illicit drug trade through the Central Intelligence Agency. And I thought, wow, this is a really interesting technology, and it's being applied in a way that could really help a lot of people. But at the same time, I had also heard that Nick Rockefeller interview with Alex Jones about, Aaron Russo, talking to his friend Nick Rockefeller about how, they want to chip us all and digital money, which I totally believe that that's the case, that they do want to push us towards a cashless society. But on a technical scale, you have to look at cryptocurrencies and just say to yourself, and a lot of people, especially in the gold and silver community, don't have the technical expertise to analyze this stuff. Cryptocurrencies and the blockchain, it's just a database technology. SQL is a database technology, structured query language. SQL was invented by a CIA subcontractor named Oracle in tandem with the CIA in the late 70s, And the whole point was so the government and the banking institutions and the corporations could all use the same databasing technology, and it would be seamless to share data between them. And SQL, to this day, it runs your credit card, it runs stock exchanges, it runs pretty much all digital assets on the planet. The blockchain is just an alternative form of database. So I'm forced to question why it is any more nefarious than a Visa database that is already in existence. That to me is very puzzling. From the standpoint of alternative media analyzing cryptocurrencies, the latest one that you've done a great job debunking, Lewis, is this AC Chain story publicized by Lynette Zhang. I find it interesting that alternative media chose to lock onto this ICO that's supposedly endorsed by the IMF, but not really at all, and is supposedly backed by the SDR, even though the retail MSDR bond has nothing to do with it. They got up into a frenzy about that, but at the same time, Lewis, the United Nations is running trial food stamp programs in Pakistan using the Ethereum blockchain on an ERC20 token. And I think that is a far more nefarious scheme than any kind of random ICO. And in a lot of ways, by damming all cryptocurrencies all at once, you're taking your eye off the ball and not realizing that this is just a technology. It can be used for very positive things, and it's also going to be used for bad things, just the same way that my WordPress blog runs on an SQL database and Visa uses it to, charge 25% interest rates,
Right. So what do you say to the argument, though, however, that cryptocurrencies are essentially on a grid? And, you did stateless homesteading, and how can you justify promoting an asset or a technology that's on grid when the idea is that when you're on grid, now you're subject to tracking and taxation and whatever else?
Well, there's a company called Blockstream that has actually just leased enough satellite space to have complete global coverage of the Bitcoin blockchain. So you no longer even have to go through an internet service provider to download and use the blockchain, which I think is really interesting. But when I was doing stateless homesteading, as a concept, not the website,
Yes.
and putting up these solar panels and growing my own food, it was far more about being individually resilient than it was necessarily escaping the smart meters or any of this kind of stuff. But on a
Well, that's a very interesting point, because just being off the grid, is that in and of itself an important thing, or is it being off the grid and being self-sufficient?
yeah, it's the model that's different. I think that. Sorry, go ahead.
Well, what I was thinking is you could be off the grid and you could be living on your stateless homestead, but you could still be transacting in Bitcoin.
Oh, totally. And I had my only connection to the grid per se is an internet connection out there.
Okay.
And I'd simply note that when I look at the history of monetary resets, for lack of a better term, there's never been one in human history, with the possible exception of the Dark Ages, where technology it kind of reverts. You know what I'm saying? Like when the British Empire handed over the pound sterling to the dollar standard in Bretton Woods, it's not as though running water stopped being a thing. I mean, you could argue that happened in Rome with the end of the aqueducts and the rise of the Byzantines. But it's a very rare thing for a international rejiggering of the monetary system to throw humanity back technologically.
Right. So what I'm trying to figure out is, if you are against blockchain technology, would you say you're a Luddite then?
I'm not against blockchain
No,
technology.
if one is, would you say, and I don't want to have you mischaracterize it, but
Sure.
are people who are fighting blockchain technology, in a sense, fighting cars, electricity, or any other technological advancement?
Yeah, you're a monetary Luddite. And this is, it might not be cool to bring this up in polite company, but there was a guy.
You've already offended my Christian audience, so
Oh,
continue.
being offensive is what I do best, I
All
guess.
right, that's the point of the show. Is again, we can disagree, and I want to have these discussions. So continue.
Oh, and I would hate to put it, if you found a spiritual worldview that works for you, that's fantastic, and I would never try and take that from you or call you stupid for believing something that I don't believe. Just to put that out there.
That's free speech. That's how, that's respect for other people. So continue.
Yeah, but I do think in a sense they are monetary Luddites. And there's a guy who wrote a book called Industrial Society and Its Future. It's otherwise known as the Unabomber Manifesto.
Yes.
By Theodore Kaczynski. And good old Ted writes in that book essentially about how he viewed the technostructure as an inherently neoliberal invention, and that it would be used to, for lack of a better term, enslave all of humanity. And his position was that, well, if you were to integrate with this technocratic Borg to fight the Borg, then eventually it will subsume you. So his whole point was, well, the only way to deal with this is to kill the people inventing the technology, which I do not subscribe to that belief at all. I think that's wrong. But at the very same time, Lewis, you have the rise of the cypherpunks and people like Timothy May saying the exact same, identifying the same problems, but offering a completely opposite solution.
Right.
They said that, by disconnecting with this technostructure, you inherently lose influence and power because this other group of people has advanced technology and you have sworn it off. Right. Exactly. It's a Brave New World scenario. I don't know if you've read that Huxley book. Yeah, but I mean, the people who are living outside of these megacities, I mean, they're literate, sure, and they have a sense of community, but they're dirt farmers and they have no power and no influence. And
doesn't it come down to then? I mean, it's correct. You are fighting on a battlefield which maybe isn't of your creation. But if you are a cyberpunk, or you're just you're benefiting from the digitization, and you can also create things that help you do better on that platform. Yes, you're on the platform, but the alternative is to be off the platform. And when you're off the platform, you miss also the benefits. And I think that's how they get you onto the platform, onto the grid, is there is a convenience and there is a benefit to being on it. The question is, how much do you give up to be onto the platform? And I know that's a discussion, is do you draw the line at the chip in your arm, or do you draw it before then? But I think if you draw it if you draw the line too early, you're right, you might as well try to just be out in the country somewhere. And there's nothing wrong with that. If you can survive and live that way and enjoy your life, that's fine. But what's interesting, all this debate and all this discussion is happening online, with people who have computers, smartphones, and so on. So it's a YouTube. So it's not like they can even think that way, because they're on a YouTube channel talking about why they shouldn't be using blockchain and technology, because eventually blockchain is going to run the internet.
Well, I mean,
is that correct to say that? I mean, it's going to run, I don't want to use incorrect terms.
That blockchain will eventually subsume all, digital communications?
Yes.
I mean, I think that further down the line, we could see something like that happen in a distributed ledger-based internet.
Right, like MaidSafe or something like that. The point is, are they going to drop off at that point, or will they see the benefit of a decentralized internet and be on that? Or will they shun it because it's digitized?
I mean, that's not a question that I can answer. I guess that's something that,
that's for our listeners. I'm just throwing that out there, and sorry, it's your show. Continue.
Oh, no. I mean, I think it's an important question that people are going to have to ask themselves increasingly as we move forward. This notion, Lewis, that all technology is inherently of the state and evil, I get where it comes from, because, modern internet architecture is all based on ARPANET.
Yes.
It's based on, CIA subcontractors like SRI. I don't know if anyone's familiar with something called the mother of all demos, but SRI, in tandem with the Defense Department back in the late 60s, essentially had a demo of modern computing, of voice over IP, of video teleconferencing, of the modern mouse, of the modern graphical user interface. And this is in the 60s. Excuse me. So yeah, this has been in the works for a long time by some people that maybe don't have our best interest in mind. But that being said, you can look at these technologies that sit atop these DoD financed infrastructure projects like the internet, and you can say that a lot of them are certainly not beneficial to the state. Do you think that these people really want, everyone? Do you think they want Smaulgld having a platform? Of course not. That's nonsensical. Or something like BitTorrent. When LimeWire and Kazaa and Napster, all these piracy sites came out in the late 90s, early 2000s, they very quickly discovered that it was easy to shut them down because they were centralized services. And then a bunch of hackers got together and came up with the BitTorrent protocol, which is a totally different, which by the way is where Bitcoin gets its name. A lot of people don't know that.
BitTorrent, right.
Yes, but BitTorrent is this protocol, if you're not familiar, where the file is not hosted in one given location. Everyone holds a copy of this file and is sharing little bits and pieces of it at any given time. So not only is there no central repository to take down, but if one node in the network should go down, the file can still be shared. The notion that Hollywood and is in support of this, or the RIIA, the recording industries.
Right.
Of course not. It's silly to think that that's the case. And blockchain and Bitcoin, I view it very much the same way, where yes, the SHA-2 algorithm, SHA-256 that Bitcoin is based off of, that's an NSA algorithm. There's no arguing that. I mean, and the same way with some of these papers, like the How to Make a Mint paper, where they're talking about somewhat distributed consensus ledgers in the 90s, working with the NSA and NTT, Nippon Telephone and Telegraph, the Japanese phone companies. Yeah, I can see why people are suspicious of that. But the brilliance of blockchain, just like the brilliance of BitTorrent, is that they've taken these deep state technologies and used them for positive things. I mean, even if SHA-256 is compromised at the algorithmic level, the fact that the blockchain is hosted everywhere and it's backed up on many computers all around the world means that attacking it as a vector is incredibly expensive and probably impossible.
Right.
And that's the middle road that advanced cryptography offers us, that we can sit on top of these compromised platforms, but make it, never. It's very difficult to compete with an entity like the NSA to make ourselves completely anonymous when they have so many resources. It's almost a pipe dream to believe that's the case. But what we can do is, if we all use these distributed systems, we can make it so expensive for them to compromise them that it's not worth their time.
I was listening to what I thought of was the American Indians, or Native Americans. When they saw the Europeans come with guns, they must have been against guns. Why? Those guns were produced and designed to harm them and kill them. However, did that mean that Indians would shun the opportunity, or Native Americans, to get their hands on some guns?
Well, look at another example of that would be the Japanese, when Admiral Perry went over with the black gunships outside of Edo. And kicked off the Meiji Restoration era. I mean, Japan had been a closed society for close to 200 years. They knew that the West existed, but they chose not to interface with it. But when they saw the power of Perry, they knew not only that they couldn't resist, but that
They had to adopt.
They had to adopt it. And of
Right.
course, that's when they built out, one of the largest empires the world has ever seen, certainly that Asia has ever seen.
So that's the argument for, you may not have created the digital system, and maybe even if you accept that the digital system was created to enslave you, you've got to pick up your digital rifle.
Yes,
That's
absolutely.
what you believe.
That's
So,
a great analogy.
I just
further,
thought of it.
And furthermore, Lewis, it's even the notion that Bitcoin may someday be compromised, or that the exchange gateways can be compromised, which is changing now with the advent of atomic swaps, being able to swap between blockchains without a centralized service.
Right.
That's a new one that you recently covered. It's that if this were some plot to enslave humanity, if it truly were the Nick Rockefeller chip in your arm plan, why would you open source it? Why would you give the Promethean fire to the masses and allow them to fork it and make their own protocol that removes your nefarious backdoors at any given time? To me, that it makes no strategic sense.
It doesn't. Now listen, Josh, I could talk to you all day, but I'm not going to. I think that's a Bill Murray line from one of the movies. I thought that's hysterical. But Josh, thank you very much for all of your insights, and we're gonna put a link below to stateless homesteading. We're going to link to Dr. BRICS Love. We did not get a chance, we'll have to have you back on, to talk about Crypto Hero, one of your other sites, which we had promised to get to during this. I will put a link to that below. And if people have any questions about Crypto Hero, then on your next time on, we'll spend more time talking about that site. Thank you very much for joining us on the Smaulgld Subscribers Sound Off Show.
Thanks for having me, Lewis.
Thank you, sir.